Right, afternoon, everyone. This is a new chapter. This is chapter 14 in your book, Monetary Policy and the Price Level. And I think this is the second last chapter in Strand 4. So this is a big chapter. It's a big enough chapter, and it's an extremely important chapter in economics because it looks at inflation and price levels, printing money, currencies, all these kind of, I wouldn't say complicated economic concepts, but certainly one of the most important economic concepts out there is monetary policy and is inflation. If you watch the shock doctrine, the one I told you to watch there a couple of weeks ago, you would notice that a lot of economists look at inflation as the worst thing that can strike an economy when prices start rising. What are the consequences of prices rising? And again, we can kind of look at this from a circular flow of, if price rises, what happens? Remember, price rises by 5 or 6 or 7% per year. We're going to look at extreme examples right now. What can happen? So inflation is a general rise in the price, and it's persistent general rise of the prices, and it continues to increase. Now, the problem, of course, with inflation, we're going to look at problems of inflation later on, but in general, like, what's the problem with inflation? It means your money is worth less. Because if prices continue to rise, it means you can buy less every time you shop. If inflation is 5% a year, it means your supermarket bill is going up by 5% per year. And then, unless that is allied to a 5% increase in your wages, it means that your purchasing power, the money, what you can do with your money, is decreasing every year, year on year. And that can cause huge issues, because if goods and services cost more, you're going to have to start making choices then on what do I buy. I think we looked at this, we looked at the law of demand, when we looked at Giffen goods and etc. You're not going to be able to buy what you normally buy. You might buy the necessities in life rather than the luxuries, and that can cause a decreased demand for other goods, which can lead then to factory closures, shop closures, fall in government revenue, and economic recessions. So inflation is extremely important to control, and we're going to be looking in this chapter at how inflation is calculated, how it's measured, how it's analyzed, and then what do governments do to control the price of goods and services, what do governments do to monitor and intervene if necessary on the inflation. And there's a couple of things we're going to do. And this is called monetary policy. Because there's quite a bit, there's not a lot of calculations in this, but there's a bit of calculations in this. So I'm going to leave the calculations off, I think, until next week. It is a Thursday today, after all. Sure, it's basically the weekend. And next week, then, we're going to look on Tuesday class, we're going to look at then calculations of inflation. It's a little bit tricky. I'm not going to say it's difficult or complicated, but it's tricky enough to do it. So really today, what we're going to do is I'm just going to introduce inflation, and we're going to look at maybe 3 case studies of where inflation has caused huge economic, social, and problems. Again, this might be the basis of perhaps a project next September for your research project. Look at an inflation. Again, looking back at the shock doctrine, that book is all about inflation and how governments intervened to stop inflation, and they do this through monetary policy, which we've discussed already. So, first example of inflation I'm going to give you is in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s, where the inflation rate, where prices, and again, for inflation, we're looking at prices, where prices started rising exponentially. The price increases were exponential rise in prices. So again, we can see it here. They went from 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000, and this is a logarithmic scale based, and you can see the prices started rising exponentially. And this is not just the price of cars and houses and everything. This is the price of bread and milk and butter, and the prices rise. Now, why did the prices rise? Well, if you want to go back in your history, what happened between 1918 and 1924? Well, in 1918, the Germans lost World War I. They were forced then, through the Versailles Treaty, to pay huge amount of repatriations to the other Western countries, to the France and the Germany. And again, I think most commentators at this stage would say that the terms of the Versailles Treaty were devastating to the German economy. They had to pay a huge amount in war repatriations to the French and the UK. essentially paid them for everything that they've lost in the cost of the war. This had a devastating impact on the German economy, which basically bankrupted the economy. And the German currency at the time, which is called the Mark, the Reich Mark, started losing value. And like a lot of things in economics, once a train is set in motion, it snowballs pretty quick. And we'll look at loads of these examples in economics throughout the course of our studies. But once inflation starts rising, once prices start rising rationally, it's very hard to stop them. It's very hard to stop them. I'm going to explain how I stopped them in a couple of other examples. As a result, the prices start going through the roof. Money becomes worthless. Money is then just a physical piece. It doesn't have any value. And it doesn't have any value because the prices are rising by like one, they're doubling every 10 minutes. And in some shops in the Weimar Republic, these prices were doubling every 10 or 15 minutes, which means if you want to buy a loaf of bread or if you want to buy some milk, you would have to carry a huge amount of currency. And the central bank then, because of the prices rising, because the loaf of bread costs like 1 million marks, they need to print more and more currency so people physically had it. It becomes worthless then at the end, and people start burning it for fuel and using it for wallpapers, etc. And this went on for quite a long time until something happened. And of course, what something happened? Well, this led to a vacuum in the German economy. This led to the downfall of the Weimar Republic. This led to the rise then of an alternative way of doing things in Germany. And I don't think I need to spell out what happened in Germany in the 1930s and subsequent 1940s. It led to the rise of fascism because of the devastating impacts of this. More recent examples of hyperinflation. This is called hyperinflation. This is when inflation goes insane. Was in Zimbabwe in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And again, same thing. What happened was it was a political decision that had economic consequences. So Robert Mugabe, who was one of the dictators in Zimbabwe at the time, came to power, and without going into too much detail, he kicked out all the foreign companies, all the foreign banks, all the foreign businesses, and he took over the state took over a lot of these farms, these big farms. Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket of Europe. It used to produce huge amounts of food. And then Robert Mugabe came in power and actively encouraged his citizens to overthrow private land for right or wrong reasons. We're not going to go there. But anyway, what was the consequence? They were kind of on their own. They were stuck on their own. They had no foreign companies or governments helping them out. And prices, because of mismanagement, prices started rising. And again, like we talked about the Weimar Republic, they started rising exponentially until every Zimbabwean was a billionaire. And they were a billionaire because for you to buy necessary products in the store or in the shop will cost you a lot of money. And the only thing they could do, the only thing the central bank in Zimbabwe could do to allow people to buy money was give everyone a raise and then print money and print money and print money. And if the prices double every day or every 2 days, people's wages needed to double then as well. So again, you'd walk into your job as a teacher or as a retailer, and you'd get paid like a billion Zimbabwean dollars a day, which sounds like great. But if the price of bread, or if the loaf of bread costs you $2 billion in Zimbabwe, it was all relative. It was all pointless. Every Zimbabwean was a billionaire, and it devastated the Zimbabwean economy because money meant nothing. Remember what a physical note is. A physical piece of a 20 euro note is not worth anything. Euros are 20 euros and our 30 or 50 euro notes are only worth something because we believe it has a value. If we don't believe that a currency has a value, then it is worthless. It is completely worthless. I actually have a stack of these in the room somewhere. I must show them to you next time you're back in. Make sure you remind me to show them. Like, this is where it peaked. It peaked at $100 trillion note. So I have like 6 or 7 of these in my room here now, and I'll show them to you when you get back. A $100 trillion note. That's how bad it went. But even then, that wasn't enough because you'd need like 1,000 of these to do your weekly shop. It was incredible. The last couple of years, really, and then since 2018, 2019, 2020, is in Venezuela. Now, Venezuela, if any have been reading up on it, this is another economy that has been devastated. depending again on your political ideology and depending on you believe in all these, I'm not even going to say conspiracy theories, but certainly Venezuela has been dealt a very bad hand in the last 10 years by the world government, the World Bank, the IMF, and the US in particular, who have shut them out of the world markets because of political reasons. And we Hugo Chavez, who was a dictator, but a benevolent dictator, if there's such a thing. And Venezuela used to be a very wealthy, respected country in South America until, well, let's go all conspiratorial, until the US government decided it had an issue with them. And it brought in all these protectionist measures and embargoes. And it didn't allow them to sell oil on the US market. It didn't allow them to access it, called the petrodollar, which is how oil is priced. So basically, Venezuela have huge amounts of oil, but they can't sell it in the open market because the US don't allow them. As a result, it had devastating consequences to the Venezuelan economy. Inflation started tipping up. Inflation started again. You can see here on the left the annual inflation rate. Like, you're not talking inflation rate of here of 5% or 10%. You're talking inflation rates here of like 140,000, which again is prices doubling every single day. Where again, when we talk about currency, we talk about how currency can be exchanged. Where one, like, again, you could have $100 billion trillion in Zimbabwe, but it was the equivalent of a $1 note, $1. And that's how these things have to end, and how they've ended in Zimbabwe, and how they're still ongoing in Venezuela. Was shopkeepers had to refuse to accept Zimbabwean dollars anymore because they were so worthless. They just didn't mean anything. So what happened on the black market, against the guidance and the intervention of the government, was that in Zimbabwe, prices started being advertised in US dollars. So for you to buy a loaf of bread would have cost you like 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, or you could buy a loaf of bread for $1. And because the US dollar was a stable currency, it was accepted. So people on the black market then started using Zimbabwean dollar, or the US dollar, and the US dollar then became the unofficial currency of Zimbabwe, because you cannot, like, a US dollar is a US dollar. A US dollar is the most valuable currency on earth, and there is no inflation really on the US dollar. So people started accepting it. And then the Zimbabwean government then created a new currency, and they did this thing called, they pegged it. So they made it equivalent to a US dollar. So they said one Zimbabwe dollar is equal to one US dollar. It's this thing called a fixed exchange rate versus a floating exchange rate. We'll talk about all of that, but you need to get to the root cause of inflation in these extreme examples. And in hyperinflation, you literally have to build your economic, monetary, and banking and financial system from scratch. And these are devastating. I mean, we've all these happy smiley faces here, smiling kids here, but these are devastating to any economy when hyperinflation grips, and it does grip. And even then, we're looking at extreme examples here, but inflation rate of 5 or 6% has really bad consequences for even Western economies. So what we're going to look at in the next class, I'm pretty much going to stop there now at the moment. Actually, just one extra thing is deflation, and deflation is the opposite of inflation. And deflation happens when prices start falling, and prices can fall as well. But not obvious to the extreme event like inflation. I mean, prices can't fall below zero or anything like that, but it can still be very damaging to the economy. And actually, what's actually happening now in Ireland is we are currently actually experiencing deflation, where people just aren't buying. If there's a really low demand for goods, people's shops and retailers start dropping their price. If they drop their prices, people are thinking, maybe they'll drop their prices even further, so I just won't purchase that thing for a while. And again, this just causes consumer demand to fall. You can see it there as well. And this affects economic growth and development in a country. So inflation, prices rise. There's extreme examples. These extreme examples are in the course, and deflation then is less destructive, but it can still be very damaging. So what we're going to look at next is what's the inflation, how is it calculated, how is it measured, how is it analyzed, etc. But just today, I'm not going to give you any homework today. Just have a look at this, and that is it. And we will kick off again next Tuesday. Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.